Hi there, this is Manuel with Tagma. Today I want to create a procedural crystal generator inside of Blender's geometry nodes. I will use Blender 4.3.0 for that, so let's dive in and get started. First select everything and get rid of it, we won't need it. Instead create a plane. And let's directly rename this plane to crystals, like so. Now let's split up my screen. I usually do it like this, 2 viewports on the left, one set to be the spreadsheet, and my main viewport will be the geometry nodes editor. Create a new node tree on the crystals object and rename it to GN crystals, just to be able to differentiate between the node tree and the object. And to start, let's create a cube. This cube is our base shape. Let's make it a little longer in Z. And I want to cut away a lot of other cubes from this cube to create this typical crystal shape. To do that, we want to first scatter points on the surface of this cube, then replace them with other cubes, and then cut them away using a Boolean operation. So to do that, let's put down a distribute points on face node and create points on the surface. Too many for my liking. Let's go down to 3. And now let's replace them with cubes using an instance on points node and another cube object. Just duplicate this one. If I now connect this to the instance port, we get a lot of cubes. And they are not the right size. I have to make sure that these cubes are large enough to cut through my object. So I want to change the size of this cube to 5 by 5 by 1, like so. And now I want to orient these cubes along the surface of the original cube. I can do that using the normals. And these normals are sampled by the distribute points on faces node and come out of this normal port. So let's use these normal vectors with the align rotation to vector node to create rotations from them. And if I now plug the rotation into this rotation, all the cubes are oriented along the surface of the original cube. Let's get rid of the side panel like so. But that is not random enough for my liking. So let's use a rotate rotation node. Funny name. If I put it there, I can post rotate my rotation, as you can see. And if I now use a random value for this, I can get some variation. So let's introduce a random value node and set this to vector because we want to define a rotation. The range is minus 0.5 to 0.5, say, like this, and now plug it here and we get a rotated mess of cubes. It's hard to make sense of what's happening here with all of these cubes, so let's solo one of the instances. For that, we can just delete every but one point from the set of points that come out of here, such that we only create one instance at a time. I will use the delete geometry node for this and put it here. Once you put it here, all the points get deleted. So let's just select one point to stay. To do that, we can use the index, outputting the index of all the points. And now let's compare this index to a number. This is an integer, so let's compare it. And we want to have this result being true for all the points but the one we selected, because then the delete geometry node will delete all these points. So we have to set this greater than operation to not equal and connect it to the selection. And you see, now only the point with index 0 remains and everything else is deleted, and we can shuffle through our instances by using this value here. And that makes it easy to check what's actually going on by temporarily using a join geometry node and join the original cube with our geometry. And you see, if I cycle through all the different cubes, you see they are cutting through my original objects. But the penetration depth is too deep for my liking. So let's move the points away from the surface a little bit. We can use a normal for this again. Let's first make some space here by moving stuff over, rotation stuff and the deletion stuff. Everything gets moved over. And let's use a set position on the points before I feed them into the delete geometry, like here. And now we can use the normal again to create an offset. If I put the normal into the offset, you see I get an offset of 1 unit. That is probably too much. So let's introduce a vector math to make the normal shorter. Switch this to scale and put it here between the normal and the offset. And now we have a mean of dialing in how much offset we need. And I don't want to set this manually. Instead, I use a random value again. So let's create a random value here and set this random value between 0.7 and 1.2. So now let's see what this gives. We now have a lot of cubes. Many of them are pushed away so far that they are not penetrating anymore, but that is not a big problem because some are penetrating and are cutting away from the surface of this cube, yielding a crystal shape. Now the problem is that we cannot cut all the instances away in one operation because the mesh boolean has problems with intersecting geometry. So we have to split this up and cut away one object at a time. For this we will need a repeat zone. So let's get one, and now we want to do everything inside of this repeat zone, one instance at a time. So feed the original cube to our repeat zone, and now move everything inside of the repeat zone. So let's move this delete geometry here and the instance on points here, and connect the geometry output to the repeat zone, like so. And now it's time to get rid of this join geometry node. It was just for visualization purposes. Instead, let's get ourselves a mesh Boolean operation. Now, what we want to do is we want to take this object and cut away one of the other cubes at a time. So we want to store the intermediate result and then use it again. That means we have to feed this here into the first mesh input of the mesh Boolean. That is the object that is cut. And now we want to cut the object that comes out of here, like so. And you see, we get one cut. But we don't want to have one cut. Instead, we want to cut all the objects here. That means we want to iterate more than one time. We want to iterate as many times as we have points. As you hover over this port here, you can see we have 31 points, and we could put them in manually here. But instead, we can use a domain size node that puts out how many points are in this domain. So if I connect this here, switch this to point cloud, this will output 31. And I can now connect this to iteration. Now the loop will cut 31 times the exact same object. So we have to vary the object with each iteration, and that is easy because we have this selection field down there, and we can just use the iteration number to feed it into here. And you see, now the loop happily cuts our cube into a nice crystal shape. Let's clean up a bit. So here we have the selection of the cutter object. Here is the begin of the repeat. Down here we have the rotation of the instances. Here we have the offset, like so. And up here we have the domain size. Very nice. And this is already a very procedural generator because we can vary the seed of the distribute points on faces node, and each seed will give us a different crystal shape because of course the points are distributed differently, and that means they are cut differently, as you can see. Now this is nice, but it looks a little generic. Next I want to introduce some edge damage. I want to use the edges to introduce more details here. And what I plan on doing is creating points from the edges and scaling these points using noise, and then turning them into an object and cutting them away from the shape with a Boolean again. So this is our first part. What we can do to make it a little bit more organized is introduce a reroute here and name it using this label field base shape. So stage 1, like so. And now let's create points from the edges. We first want to delete all the faces and then turn the edges into curves and then put points on these curves. So we can first use another delete geometry node and delete all the faces, but make sure to switch this all to only faces, and that will keep all the edges. Now that we have the edges, we can turn them into a curve with mesh to curve. And now we can turn them into points by using curve to points, like so. Now we get 10 points on every edge, not very even, so let's switch count to length. And if we use a length of 0.02, we get a lot of points, as you can see. Now next I want to make these points larger or smaller using noise, and I want to turn them into an object. Let's turn them into an object first. So I first want to turn the points into a volume using points to volume. And that gives a volume from the points with a radius of 0.5 meters per point. That is a little large. Let's go down to 0.1 for now. And let's up the resolution, the voxel amount, to 200 to get a little bit of definition in our volume. And now with this volume, I can use volume to mesh to create a mesh from it, like so. But all the edges are exactly the same thickness. Next, we want to vary this, and we want to vary this using noise. So let's put down a noise texture that we can use to vary the noise. I use the scale of 2.4 here, and let's connect the output to the radius. And you see, you get a lot of variation with the radius now, but the radius is far too large. So let's introduce a map range node to be able to dial in the range of the radius that we are looking for. And the largest radius I want to see is 0.2, like so. And now you see you get a lot of variation on the thickness. But But at the moment I have thickness everywhere, and I only want thickness at some places because I only want to cut into the object at some places, not everywhere. So I have to fiddle with my values. For this I can use a float curve. At the moment the noise texture outputs values between 0 and 1, and I want everything that is, say, smaller than 0.4 to stay 0. So I can just move this point over. That means that only some places get a radius larger than 1 and only some places create the object. We can move this not over 2 to make this a little bit more pronounced, say, like so. And this gives our cutter object. And now that we have that, we again can do a Boolean operation between our original shape and this shape here. So another Boolean is needed, mesh Boolean, put it here. And this time we want to cut our base shape by our created object. Let's see what that gives, and that eats into our object and creates edge damage. The problem is that it cuts in too deeply, so I again want to move all of this stuff outwards. And I do a little trick here, because in the very beginning I had this. So if I want to move everything out, I can just move these edges out before I create points from them. I will use the normals to do this in the very, very beginning. So let's use a set position just before turning this into curves. And let's use the normal of the shape. And let's use a vector math again. Scale the normal like so. Normal goes into the scale. Scale goes into the offset. That offsets everything by an amount of 1. That is too much, so go down to 0.02, say. And by getting rid of the viewer, we can see now we have a dial for specifying how deeply these objects are eating into the surface. 0.02 is probably a good value. And now the crystal looks a lot more organic than before. Before we continue, let's clean up again. This is noise stuff, and over here we have the second Boolean, and we can call this, by introducing another reroute, edge damage, like so. Nice. Now we are finished with the outside of the crystal, but a crystal is transparent and thus we need internal structure too. We want to model some cracks inside of the crystal because these make the crystal really shimmer and shine later. That will be a second geometry stream that we then merge with this one. So let's continue from the base shape again. And the strategy is similar to what I did before. I want to scatter a lot of planes this time and then cut them by the shape of the crystal and creating internal structure. To scatter these planes, I will go a different route this time. I first want to create a bounding box node to get an object from the bounds of our base shape. Let's temporarily cut the group output here and move it over there to see what we are doing. That creates the bounding box object. And now I want to create a line between the lowest and the highest face over here. So to do this, we can use a sample index node that can sample any attribute by using an index, and we want to sample a vector as we want to sample the position of the faces. To make this work, we need a position node and connect it here because that is the value that will be sampled, and then we connect the bounding box here. We want to do this 2 times, one for the lowest face, for the bottom face, and one for the topmost face. And by experimentation, I found out that the lowest face is 0 and the topmost face has an index of 2. So now we get the position of the lowest and the highest face. And we can use these positions to create a curve line. Just connect this to the start and that to the end, giving us a line that is exactly the height of the object. Now let's resample this line to give it more points, like so, and we want to create 50 points from this curve. And now we want to delete some of the points as we are only interested in some of the points. Now let's put a lot of grids on these points. For this we want to use an instance on points node again, and this time we use a grid, put the grid into the instance port, and you see you get a stack of many planes. We want to make sure that these grids are large enough to cut through our object, so let's use a size of 2 by 2. But that is a lot of planes and we want to have as many, so let's delete some of the points before we use them as instance locations. Introduce a delete geometry node and put it here, deleting everything. And this time we want to randomly pick some points. So we want to use a random value, generating values between 0 and 1, and we want to compare these values to a value of our own. I say 0.9 for now, and we want to see if the value is less than that. And if so, please delete. And now we can vary the seed here to see we get different distributions of planes. Maybe we up the value to 0.94 as I had it in my setup to make sure that we don't get too many planes. Okay, now we have planes, but they are all oriented in the same way. We have to vary the orientation. This time this is easy. You already know how it goes. We will introduce another random value, switch it to vector. This time we want to have all the possible orientations, so put -1 here and 1 here, giving vectors the point to all the directions, like so. Turn this vector into a rotation, again with a line rotation to vector, put it here, and now we can use this for our rotation, and we get many rotated planes. And now for the cutting. This time we want to use a loop again, but we have a problem that is stated the other way around. We don't want to cut the same object over and over again. Instead, we want to cut every plane with the same object. That is why we have to use a different kind of loop. We want to use a for each element loop this time. So put a for each element loop down and connect all the instances to this for each element loop and the output of the for each element loop to the group output. Be careful, make sure to use the second output here because that is the geometry constructed by the loop. And now first we want to realize the instances by putting down a realize instances node in here so that we have real geometry, and now we can cut the stuff. So if I now connect this here, we don't get a lot, but to make the loop work we of course have to switch to instances, and you see now it's doing exactly the same thing but one instance at a time. But these are just thin sheets and Boolean does not work with thin sheets, so we have to give them some thickness. It's easy to do that. We want to use an extrude mesh and put it there to extrude them. That is of course a lot of extrusion. Go down to 0.02 to give very, very thin sheets and turn off individual. Now we have sheets with thickness. But the extrusion just kills the original face. So to get it back, we want to join it back in. So create join geometry and join back in the original face like so. But be careful because we have to deal with the normal orientation here. Let's quickly turn on face orientation and you see the original face has a wrong orientation. So let's flip the faces of this original face like so and then put it into the merge. Like this. And now we have correctly oriented normals. But because of joining the geometry, these pieces are still not connected. So we want to connect them by using a merge by distance like this. And now we have connected objects that we can use for the Boolean. And remember, this all happens on one piece at a time. So the merge by distance will not merge all the points of the geometry together, but just the points of one of the sheets. And now we can do the Boolean. So let's get ourselves a mesh Boolean, put it there. And this time we want to switch this to intersection because we want to calculate the intersection of this with the geometry that we have down here. So let's move this geometry into there and you see this cuts every sheet one after the next with the geometry that we created before, creating beautiful internal structure. So let's name this geometry stream by introducing a new reroute and call this cracks. Now here we have the cracks and down there we have the edge damage. Time to join the two. Join the cracks with the edge damage to create the final object, and let's see how it looks by connecting this there. And you see if we turn off face orientation and turn on X-ray, we see now we have internal structure inside of the volume of our crystals. That is exactly what we need. But there's one more thing that we have to deal with, and that is that we want to flip the faces of all the internal pieces again, because remember we want to give it a transparent transparent shader. That means a ray of light is hitting the surface, that it's entering the volume, and then it's hitting one of these cracks. So to the ray, it looks as if it is hitting a surface from the outside, yielding wrong results in the refraction. So instead, what we want to do is we want to flip the normals of these pieces such that they act as internal surfaces. So get yourself a flip faces again and just put it on this top stream here. Now this makes sure that the crack faces are flipped and everything is prepared for the shading. Now talking about shading, to be able to shade this, we want to quickly create a material. So go to materials, create a new material and call it m_crystals, and let's apply the material by using a set material node and put the M crystal here. Now for shading the crystal, I quickly switch to the 3D viewport here. Let's first create a camera and let's look through the camera over here. I switch my resolution to 1920 by 1920 to have a square camera and lock the camera here, move out a little like this. But I want to place the camera using values, so go to 0 and 0 rotation, and then I want to rotate along X by 90 degrees and move the entire thing back in Y, like so. Now I need a background. For that I just create a simple plane, rotate it around the X and move it to the back, scale it up a little bit to fill the viewport, like so. And then we want to have a light. So let's create a light, an area light, and I don't want to rotate the area light all the time. That is why I do a little rig. I create an empty that acts as a target for the light to look at. Then I go to the light, create a track to constraint and select my empty here, making the light always look to the empty. And now I can move the light over there, say, and now switch to rendered view. If we quickly switch to cycles, we get a crystal that is lit from the side. Gives this light a lot more power, say 1000, and put it somewhere here. And then for the ambient, I want to use an HDR that I got in my asset browser. I downloaded it from Polyhaven, and I want to use this Nagoya wall path. Can use it by just dragging and dropping it there, and that gives a nice ambient, as you can see. So that is my rendering setup. Now let's try to create a nice shader for our object. So for the shading, the very first thing I want to do is to go to the geometry node setup again and set shade smooth on the indented damage areas. For this I create a set shade smooth node, and I only want to use this node on the volume stuff. This will smooth shade only these indents. And as you can see, we have these lines here from the inside cracks. And what I want to do now is I want to create an edge value for these inside planes that I can use as a mask to mask them off in shading. So for now, let's just cut this connection to just see the inside. And at the moment, if I turn on wireframe, you see that we do not have enough geometry to really put a value on the geometry inside of geometry nodes. So go to where we defined the grid and up the geometry to 40 subdivisions like this, and that is probably enough geometry to put a value on. And now I want to create a store named attribute, and I just want to put it here on this geometry stream before the join geometry, and I want to call it edge. And now I want to calculate the distance of every point of this geometry to the hull. For this I want to create a geometry proximity, and I want to calculate the proximity of the position of the points of this geometry. So I create a position node. That is my sample position, and the geometry to test is the edge damage, so the outer hull. And this will create a distance, and I will set this distance to the edge. We can quickly check this with the viewer node. If we just put it here, you see, we now get a gradient. The further away a point is from the outer hull, the lighter it appears. And that is useful for creating a mask in shading. So let's get rid of this viewer, and let's reintroduce this geometry to the join there. And now let's switch over to the shader editor. I don't want to use a principled BSDF, so let's get rid of it. Instead, I want to use a glass BSDF. Crystal really has an IOR of 1.5, so keep it like this and set 0.1 for the roughness. connected here. Now this is quite nice. Let's quickly rotate our model a little. I think this side is probably a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit further, like so. And I have the feeling that we want to rotate our light. So maybe rotate the light a little bit to the side, like so, such that we get this highlight here. That is nice. Back to the shader editor. Now, you see these crackles in here, and they are very sharp. Let's smooth them out by using the edge value. But for this, it's probably easier if we quickly go back to the geometry and cut this connection to just see the inside cracks. Now, bring in the attribute using an attribute node. The attribute was called edge. Let's test it. Here it is. And now we can use this to blend between two shaders. So we will need a mix shader, and we can use the value of the attribute as the mixing parameter. For now, I want to create a diffuse BSDF, set it to red, put it here in the first socket, and our glass shader in the second socket, and you can see it mixes between the two. But you see that the gradient is linear, and that means we have a lot of red and only very little glass. But we can change that. If we introduce a float curve, we can remap our values. The first thing I want to do is to set the vector type to linear, and then I can just move this knot over to make this gradient a lot steeper, like so. And you see now you have glass only in the middle, and then you have these red areas. And to get rid of them, you just replace the red diffuse BSDF by transparent BSDF. Like so. And we want to play with the float curve a little more. If you now move around your crystal, then you see that you have soft edges around these inner cracks. That's nice. So now we can go back to geometry nodes and reintroduce the outer geometry. And unfortunately it disappears because the edge value is not set. So let's set an edge value on this stream too, set it to 1, and then the outside suddenly appears again, like so. Very good. Now let's see if we rotate the crystal a little bit more, if we can find a more interesting angle, maybe something like this. And of course it's a good idea to switch my renderer to GPU mode, because this will be a little bit faster, like so. Maybe like this. Let's adjust the light one more time. Let's see where we can get a nice angle for the light to reflect off our surface. Like this. Okay, we are pretty much there. Maybe I want to increase the quality of my viewport rendering like this. And we have already a quite nice crystal. So the very last thing I want to do is I want to introduce dispersion. Because in reality, crystal bends the light differently by looking at the wavelength of the light. So red light will get a different bending by refraction than green light or blue light. And I want to model this in my shader. So let's go back to the shader editor again. Click the crystal. Let's see, frame selected, frame all. Here we are. And we can model this by duplicating this glass BSDF. Instead of using a white one, let's use 3 different glass BSDFs for the colors red, green and blue, and give them slightly different IORs. This will yield different bending of the light, and if we mix everything together again, we get a white crystal, but we will get dispersion at the borders, and that will look nice. So first let's get rid of the diffuse and now duplicate the glass BSDF 2 times. The first will be set to red, so go to RGB mode and set it to pure red. The second one will be green, so same story, but we will only have a value of 1 in green, and the last one will be blue, like this. And now let's change the IOR. 1.5 is okay, the green one will get 1.52 and the blue one will get 1.54, like so. And now we have to add them together. For this we can use an add shader, add together the red and the green, and now add together the result of this operation with the blue. And instead of using the first glass shader here in our mix shader, we want to use the result of this. And now you see you get this nice dispersion effect. Let's duplicate the glass shader one more time, make it white again, just to be able to check the difference. So if I connect this here, this is what you get. And if you connect this add shader, you get this slight tint here. And you can of course make it stronger. If for example you spread the IORs even further, like 1.54 and 1.58, then you get a stronger dispersion effect. That is up to you how much you want. I think it's better if it's just subtle. So I will put it to the values from before. And now let's calculate this for a second. And and you see you have a beautiful crystal with internal cracks and a lot of detailing on the surface. And that concludes my tutorial about this crystal generator. You now have a procedural system to generate crystals because you can go back to the Geometry Nodes editor, and if you remember at the very beginning of our setup we had this distribute points on faces node, and this node is in charge of distributing the points for the cutters. So if you change this seed you just get another crystal. So if I just go here to 10 I get a new crystal, and if I go to 11 I will get another one, and if I go to 12 I get another one. So you can animate this and then you get a lot of different crystals that you can use in your projects. I hope you learned something in this tutorial, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!